Opening the center's diagonal immediately offers a direct path to immediate development and a central pawn structure. Mirroring your opponent's central pawn advance immediately contests the heart of the board and opens diagonals for piece development. This central pawn thrust immediately challenges the black king's pawn and develops a knight, preparing for further piece activity and a central foothold. Developing the knight to its natural square, nc6 efficiently contests the e4 pawn's advance and prepares for further central expansion. Developing the knight here allows for potential central pawn advances and reinforces the e4 pawn, preparing for solid central control. Developing a piece and challenging the opponent's pawn creates immediate central tension and opens lines for further action. Launching a central pawn thrust, white immediately challenges black's pawn structure and aims to open lines for piece activity. Accepting the pawn thrust opens the center, creating dynamic possibilities and demanding precise development from both sides to seize initiative. Reclaiming the center with the knight opens lines and pressures black's central pawn structure, a classic opening principle in action. Provoking a pawn to advance, this bishop aims to disrupt white's central control and create attacking chances. Unbalancing the pawn structure for immediate structural advantage, this capture sacrifices the knight's influence on the center to disrupt black's kingside stability, creating doubled pawns that will require careful management and potentially open lines for future pawn advances. Opening the b-file to your opponent creates immediate central tension and offers tactical possibilities, though it also potentially weakens your pawn structure. Solidifying the center and preparing to unleash the queen, this bishop deployment aims to control the crucial d3h7 diagonal, potentially threatening black's undeveloped kingside and creating a stable pawn structure for future central advances. Prioritizing king's safety is a wise decision here, bringing the monarch to a secure corner and preparing for central pawn advances. The doubled pawns on the queen side, a consequence of the earlier exchange, now become less of an immediate concern as the king is tucked away. Securing your monarch behind a pawn shield, this castling maneuver prepares for a potential central pawn push while simultaneously bringing the rook into the game. Unleashing a central pawn thrust, black aims to disrupt white's delicate pawn structure and gain crucial central space, potentially opening lines for their pieces while forcing concessions. Capturing the pawn on d5 immediately releases the central tension, opening lines and offering immediate counterplay by challenging black's central pawn structure. This bold capture forces a decision, potentially leading to a sharper game where piece activity and initiative will be paramount. White embraces the ensuing complexity, accepting the structural consequences in exchange for dynamic possibilities. Accepting the pawn forces open a central file, potentially activating your rook, but it also weakens your pawn structure on the queen side, leaving those pawns somewhat isolated and vulnerable later on. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure and preventing any immediate bishop infiltration towards g2 are the primary goals here, creating a safe haven for the monarch while subtly preparing for future central pawn breaks or piece maneuvering. Bringing the rook to the open b-file exerts immediate pressure, threatening to infiltrate white's queenside territory and disrupt the harmony of the white pieces. This aggressive posture aims to exploit any lingering weaknesses created by white's pawn structure, potentially forcing concessions or creating tactical opportunities. Unveiling a latent threat against the black king, the queen now eyes the weakened c6 pawn and the undeveloped queenside, creating dual-purpose pressure that demands immediate attention. Reclaiming the pawn immediately creates a symmetrical pawn structure, but it also opens the b-file for your rook, which can be a very active piece in the upcoming exchanges. The bishop on b7 now puts pressure along the long diagonal, potentially targeting white's kingside or even white's central pawn structure if it advances further. This move also prepares for further development, possibly by bringing the other bishop into play or supporting a central pawn push later. It's a flexible move that aims to activate pieces and generate counterplay. Intensifying pressure on the d5 pawn, this square becomes a focal point where black's pawn chain now presents a potential weakness. challenging the bishop's advantageous placement. This move aims to disrupt white's harmonious development by forcing a decision on the g5-h4 diagonal, potentially creating weaknesses around the white king if the bishop retreats to a less active square. Sacrificing the bishop for the knight creates immediate doubled pawns for black on the c-file, a clear positional concession, yet white must consider if the subsequent pressure on the weakened kingside will outweigh the loss of material and the potential open lines for black's rooks. Reclaiming the pawn with the queen immediately restores material equality, but it also centralizes your most powerful piece, eyeing potential weaknesses on white's kingside and opening up diagonal lines for your bishop. This action not only addresses the immediate tactical threat, but also prepares for future king safety considerations and potential queenside counterplay once the central tension resolves. Simplifying into a rook and pawn endgame, white proactively trades queens, aiming to leverage their slightly more active rook and potentially exploit black's doubled c-pawns later. Opening up the g-file for your rook to potentially exploit becomes a primary objective now, though it comes at the cost of a doubled pawn structure that will demand careful handling to avoid creating weaknesses. Reorienting the knight to e2 aims to consolidate black's isolated pawn structure by supporting a potential future d4 advance, while also clearing the f3 square for possible piece maneuvering later on. Establishing a robust central pawn presence and preparing for eventual pawn breaks becomes paramount now that black's queenside structure has been irrevocably altered, fostering a slightly cramped but potentially dynamic position. Reclaiming centralized knight control, the monarch's protector ventures forward, aiming to initiate a subtle reshaping of the central pawn structure and potentially target squares like f5, while simultaneously preparing for a more active role in controlling the d-file. Repositioning the bishop from its active attacking square back to the queen's flank seems like a concession of the center, but it aims to solidify the pawn structure and prepare for a more defensive setup, while simultaneously unblocking the c8-h3 diagonal for potential future queen involvement. The pawn advanced to b3 opens up the queen's diagonal for potential future activity and aims to solidify the queenside pawn structure, preventing any immediate black knight infiltration to c4 while also preparing for a potential queenside expansion. Reactivating the rook to the open e-file now seeks to exploit the king's exposed position and the potential for future pressure along that central column. Reclaiming the central files and preparing for a potential central pawn push signifies white's intention to open lines for his rooks and exploit the weakened kingside structure black has created. Reasserting the king's presence becomes paramount after the recent pawn structure adjustments, bringing it into a more active role to support the vulnerable queenside pawns and potentially participate in future counterplay. Launching a pawn thrust at f4, white boldly aims to seize more territory in the center and prevent black's pieces from finding comfortable squares, particularly the bishop on d6, which now has its diagonals further restricted. This aggressive pawn push, however, does create a slight weakness on e3, a potential target for black's pieces if white isn't careful with their king's safety. The creation of this central pawn chain also hints at an intention to potentially advance the g-pawn later, aiming to cramp black's position further and perhaps prepare an attack against the king. Black's bishop finds a more active square, eyeing the d2 pawn and reinforcing control over the central light squares, potentially setting up pressure along the d-file once the rooks become connected. Averting immediate danger, the king shifts to a slightly safer square, preparing to integrate into the central game and potentially avoid the open file dangers ahead. Embracing the open b-file, the rook aims to exploit newfound activity and potentially support a queenside pawn push later on. Reclaiming the open d-file is a primary objective for white, but the rook's repositioning to f3, while aiming to challenge black's queenside pawn structure, neglects the immediate threat of black's pieces accumulating pressure on the kingside, potentially creating a dangerous outpost for the bishop on b4. Sensing an opportunity, black aims to exploit the open d-file by bringing the rook into play, potentially creating threats against white's king and developing a more active presence in the center. A bold foray towards the black king, aiming to exploit the weakened kingside after the pawn structure was shattered, though it sacrifices immediate central control and potentially leaves the knight exposed to future pawn advances. A bold gamble, plunging the rook into enemy territory, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and perhaps create attacking chances down the central files, though it leaves the king's flank potentially exposed. Exchanging the rooks now simplifies the position and forces black to confront the doubled f-pawns, a significant structural weakness that will likely become a target in the ensuing middle game or endgame. Suddenly, the intricate dance of piece exchanges on the queenside has culminated in a stark positional reality. Black's bishop, once a menace, now finds itself awkwardly stranded on e1, a misplaced ornament after that decisive rook sacrifice. This recapture, while materializing the exchange, paradoxically leaves black with a somewhat compromised pawn structure and a diminished scope for their remaining pieces, particularly that bishop which now has a questionable future. White, meanwhile, has successfully disrupted black's coordination and is poised to exert pressure on the queenside. The open d-file, now a highway for white's rooks, presents a tangible advantage that will require black's utmost vigilance to neutralize. Shifting the rook to the third rank aims to activate it on the open e-file, preparing to contest control and potentially support advances up the board. Sensing the potential for a dynamic encounter, black redirects their bishop to the open diagonal, creating immediate pressure and threatening to disrupt white's central pawn structure. This active placement also prepares for future pawn advances or piece regroupings. Shifting the rook's focus towards the kingside, this maneuver aims to exploit black's slightly exposed monarch and potentially create attacking avenues. Black solidifies the center and prepares for a potential kingside pawn storm. Repositioning the rook to this active file immediately pressures black's exposed king, forcing a difficult decision about how to defend. Black finally marshals their central pawn mass, initiating a dynamic pawn thrust to challenge white's control over the d4 square and potentially open lines for their bishop and rook. Reasserting pressure on the central pawn structure after black's audacious pawn thrust. Black's rook now eyes the central d4 pawn and potentially aims to disrupt white's king safety. Aggressively contesting the open d-file opens up lines of attack, but it leaves the pawn structure on the queenside somewhat vulnerable to future incursions. The pawn advance to a5 aims to gain queenside space and hinder white's knights from occupying the c4 square, while also creating a potential outpost for the bishop on b7. Repositioning the knight to its initial square might seem like a step backward, but it's a clever maneuver to avoid the knight's current awkward placement on the kingside, now blocked by its own pawns and the exposed king. This allows the knight to potentially join the central struggle or support a queenside advance, offering more flexibility than the restrictive g3 square. It also subtly prepares for potential pawn breaks or a regrouping of forces, aiming for a more active and harmonious setup. Re-establishing bishop pressure on the long diagonal, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create attacking chances on the kingside if white's pieces become uncoordinated. Reclaiming the f-file for rapid reinforcement becomes the immediate priority, offering a flexible retreat for the knight and a potential avenue for regrouping the beleaguered queenside. Re-establishing contact with the queenside becomes paramount as the bishop retreats, aiming to support the pawn on a 5 and potentially pressure the central pawns from a distance. Reclaiming the knight from its passive outpost on g3, the repositioning to d2 initiates a subtle shift in white's strategic aims, preparing to re-enter the fray on the kingside or potentially support a central pawn advance. Black's bishop, after a long journey, finally occupies the strategically vital c3 square, directly challenging white's pawn structure and preparing to harass the white queen if it dares to reposition. The king, seeking shelter from the storm of black's advancing pawns, finds a slightly better vantage point on g1, preparing to sidestep any immediate threats lurking on the open files. The bishop scurries back to d5, aiming to solidify black's pawn chain and offer an escape square for the knight if the f-file opens. This retreat seeks to consolidate the position after white's king repositioning, attempting to create a more robust defensive structure. It's a quiet regrouping maneuver, prioritizing stability over immediate threats, and hints at Black's desire to avoid further concessions in the center while simultaneously preparing for potential counterplay. Unblocking the queen's bishop and aiming for central penetration, NC4 injects a dose of dynamism into White's somewhat passive setup, forcing Black to consider its pawn structure and the newly opened diagonal. Sacrificing the bishop here surrenders a vital positional advantage, opening up the c-file for White's rook and creating an isolated pawn on c6 that can become a long-term weakness. While it seems to relieve the pressure on Black's kingside, it fundamentally weakens the pawn structure and diminishes Black's attacking prospects. Opening the b-file now, White intends to activate the rook, but this dramatically weakens the queenside pawn structure, potentially creating targets for Black's pieces. A strategic regrouping effort begins, aiming to reposition the rook from the vulnerable open file and prepare for a potential breakthrough on the kingside or a more active presence on the queenside. Shifting the rook to the second rank offers flexibility, preparing to challenge that intruding bishop on c3 or potentially swing over to support a pawn push on the queenside, aiming to disrupt Black's pawn structure and gain some breathing room. Sensing the opportunity to disrupt White's consolidated pawn structure, the rook ventures to b4, aiming to probe weaknesses along the now doubled c-pawns and potentially activate the bishop on c3, creating dynamic counterplay. Saddling the rook with the isolated pawn on a5 severely restricts its mobility, turning it into a passive piece that can barely influence the game. The rook's descent onto the first rank, though tempting for immediate pawn acquisition, overlooks the burgeoning space advantage Black has cultivated on the queenside, potentially leaving the piece exposed to a swift counterattack. Seizing the initiative, the rook now aggressively penetrates the enemy position on the third rank, disrupting Black's pawn structure and threatening further incursions that could unravel their defenses. Initiating a desperate counterattack with the rook, aiming to disrupt White's consolidated position and perhaps force concessions before White's pieces can fully exploit the opened lines around the king. The monarch, now exposed on the kingside, endeavors to find refuge from the persistent threats emanating from Black's active pieces, particularly the rook that just delivered a check. The black pawn boldly advances, a seemingly small step, but one that immediately creates a pressing tactical threat, aiming to disrupt White's recently consolidated position and potentially exploit the exposed White king. Seizing the open file offers the initiative, but the pawn sacrifice on the kingside now looks like a significant positional concession, weakening the structure and potentially leaving the king exposed. The rook now boldly ventures to the first rank, eyeing the king's shelter and opening the door for potential tactics. A decisive blow is struck, aiming to dismantle Black's pawn chain and pry open the king's defenses through tactical pressure. Finally, Black attempts to activate the rook by bringing it back into the game, though its journey has been quite circuitous. The Black king, exposed on the back rank, is now directly attacked as White forces a perpetual check sequence. The rook's retreat, while seemingly a loss of tempo, aims to consolidate and find safety, momentarily abandoning the open file after White's aggressive capture, setting the stage for a potential defensive regrouping amidst the looming material deficit. Exchanging the rook on the open file simplifies the position, creating an endgame where White's king can become more active to support the remaining pawns. The Black king, finally freed from its protective pawn shield, now ventures into the open, a daring journey with immense potential for both immediate counterplay and long-term exposure to the opposing rook's menacing presence on the 8th rank. Securing the queenside pawn structure becomes paramount with this advance, aiming to create a passed pawn and disrupt Black's potential counterplay on that flank. The passed pawn on the file now aggressively marches forward, threatening to become an unstoppable force, forcing White to react directly and consider defensive placements. The bishop finally finds an active outpost, eyeing the compromised kingside pawn structure and preparing to support the advance of the queenside majority. The king marches forward, seeking activity and a more central post for the impending endgame, while preparing to connect the remaining pawns. The king boldly advances, seeking a more active role in this endgame, aiming to participate in the pawn struggle on the king side. The bishop tucks back to observe the advancing pawns and potentially fortify the pawn's progress, anticipating white's kingside pawn push to ultimately gain space. The pawn's advance creates an unstoppable force, aiming to disrupt the opponent's piece coordination and forge a decisive passed pawn that will demand constant attention, potentially leading to a swindle or a swift conclusion. Reclaiming a pawn's lost territory with the f-pawn now presents a significant positional challenge, as it directly confronts white's central pawn majority and aims to disrupt its coordinated advance. The king ventures forward, aiming to support the pawns and potentially activate itself in the endgame, but it exposes itself to immediate checks, a bold but risky maneuver. Relinquishing the d-file to white's rook is a considerable positional concession, essentially inviting doubled pawns and further pressure on black's already compromised queenside. Initiating a calculated advance with the monarch to secure crucial central territory and disrupt black's pawn structure. Securing a vital outpost for the bishop in this simplified exchange, aiming to disrupt white's central pawn structure and prepare for potential counterplay along the now open files. Solidifying the pawn chain on the king side by pushing h4 further prepares for potential king safety operations or creating new avenues of attack. Embracing a new vista, the bishop repositions to a square that, while momentarily passive, offers a subtle threat of infiltrating white's queenside pawn structure should the knight on f1 decide to advance. Securing the king's safety with a final pawn push establishes a defensive wall, preparing for potential rook activity on the open files. Finally, the bishop finds its way back to a more active diagonal, seeking to contest the central squares and potentially support an advance for the remaining pawns. The king's vault is finally breached, opening a direct path to victory. Snapping up, the bishop clears the diagonal for the rook and forces a drastic simplification, as the opponent must now abandon the pawn race to address the unleashed threat. The pawn's onward march begins its endgame dance, seeking to occupy crucial squares and disrupt the opponent's coordination. Sacrificing the bishop to clear the king's path for immediate promotion creates a dangerous race against time. Unleashing the king from its protective pawn shield, this aggressive advance seeks to exploit the exposed black monarch, aiming for a swift conclusion amidst the chaotic remnants of the board. The black king, having achieved its endgame objective of reclaiming the central pawns, now finds itself critically exposed, a beacon inviting the white monarch's predatory advance. King's journey concludes, a dramatic dash across the board to a safe square. The king, now unescorted and exposed to the elements, seeks refuge amongst the enemy pawns, a precarious sanctuary where its every step is watched. Securing the bishop's position on the queen's flank is paramount as the game enters its final stages, aiming to limit black's counterplay and solidify white's advantage. Exploring the squares of the king's potential escape route, this decision aims to occupy more territory, a desperate attempt to keep the game from collapsing into an inevitable checkmate. The king ventures out, a bold maneuver seeking active participation in the endgame's final skirmishes. The bishop retreats, sacrificing its active central post for a more defensive posture on the queenside, aiming to support the pawn structure and potentially contest the queenside majority. Stepping out from the shadows, the king ventures to take a more active role, aiming to support the pawn advance and control crucial squares in this unfolding endgame. The king's journey now ventures into the heart of the opponent's territory, seeking a sanctuary amidst the looming pawn formations. The king boldly marches forward, seeking to solidify its position in the center and offer support to the advancing pawns. That capture on the c2 pawn finally brings black's king into a more active position, aiming to exploit the open lines and potentially threaten white's somewhat exposed monarch.